Hello all, I'm Kel Kidman and welcome to Breaking on the Daily, where today we begin with a bit of a crisis on the border because you see the Texas governor has declared that there is in fact a crisis on the border, and this has been something that has been boiling under the surface for a while now. Ever since President Biden got into office, there have been caravan after caravan story coming out over and over again, really just bringing into full focus how big of an issue the border was, and particularly how much of an issue it was before Trump, and how much of an issue it's going to be for the next few years. And this is a bit, I might say, worrying. The reason being that these is thousands of people who are coming across the border, and in all likelihood going to be used as political footballs for the next, at least 4 years, if not much longer. And this is quite the sad thing, honestly, because many of these people are truly coming from not great situations. I'm not pro-illegal immigration, to be clear, and these people are breaking the law. I do think that they should be put back into Mexico, since Mexico is not a particularly dangerous state or anything like that. But it is sad to see that so many people have to flee from their own countries to come to America to even get part of what the American dream is. And it is also really bad for domestically. It's really bad for the American worker because it ends up lowering the actual sort of wages you can get, because that's how supply and demand works. But this crisis has been denied by Biden. This shouldn't be particularly surprising, seeing as he's a cloistered dementia patient, but it does show that he is not really in touch with any sort of thing that's going on outside of the Washington, D.C. bubble. And it's not as though President Biden was particularly interested in immigration or anything that was happening on the border in the first place, but it should be said that it is much more important what the actual border governors are saying about it, particularly the Texas governor, considering he makes up a large proportion. His state borders Mexico the most out of any state in the Union. Those sorts of opinions are much more important than someone in D.C. who's just stuck there and isn't actually learning or doing anything about this particular issue because they don't really care about it. And that's really what President Biden is doing with all of this. That's kind of how I see what he's saying. And it's worth it to mention as well that he was making these comments in the first press conference he's had since he's been president. It's been 48 days since he's had a press conference, and this time, when the press actually started asking questions of him, they were ushered out. They were removed. It is utterly ridiculous to see just how cloistered this guy is. And really, his policy has seemed pretty aimless, honestly. I haven't seen really a really coherent strategy with regard to his entire policy. It seems just to be either shotgun it, which would be the massive amounts of executive orders, or do essentially nothing, which is what it seems to be on the actual legislative side, where the Democrats are putting up a whole lot of stuff that's not going to get through. H.R. 1, H.R. 127, those sorts of things. Of course, there are other bills they actually want to get passed, but many of those aren't probably going to be passed either. But that's what that seems to be. But there is a lot of Biden aimless policy, and it doesn't just make itself known at the border policy today, but it also makes itself known with Biden endorsing a law that is going to endanger 57 million jobs. Which, man, that's a new record, because what this law is, it is a kind of a throwback, because I've talked about this law before, particularly when it was rejected by California, of all places, because this is about the law that was the freelancing law in California. If for anyone who remembers that saga, essentially California put up a law that essentially outlawed freelancing and made it so that any freelancer who did any significant amount of work for a single place, that they would essentially be treated as employees, meaning that all California freelancing was essentially dead for a hot minute there, But it was put on the ballot, I believe, in 2020, and then it was rejected by them because, well, it's an insane policy that ruined a whole lot of jobs in California. And this bill, I think it's called the PRO Act, is just the same law. It's almost the exact same thing, where they are redefining what a freelancer is to be something where you're not doing anything substantial for the company. If you're doing consistent or you're doing anything with any sort of frequency, then you are not considered a freelancer under this law. Rather, you're considered an employee of that company. And here's the problem with this. There are many problems with this, of course. First of all, it completely ignores economics. I mean, it ignores the fact that the freelancer wants to be a freelancer too, so why do you care that they want to be a freelancer? Why are you so obsessed with getting them workers' rights that they didn't want in the first place? But it's also ignoring a lot of things in terms of the, I would say, law perspective. I don't know how good this is as a law. It really is quite terrible, and the definitions are equally awful. But it hurts a lot of freelancers and small businesses from each side of the spectrum, because freelancers don't want to be employees of whatever place they're freelancing for. If they wanted to be employees, they'd apply. The reason you want to freelance, and for what I'm doing on any of the video hosting platforms I'm doing, is essentially freelance work itself. The only difference is I'm not really being paid, at least not at this point. But in terms of people who are actually getting paid on YouTube or something like that to make YouTube videos, what they are doing is essentially the same thing as freelance work, just in a less formal manner. So what this law would potentially end up doing is turn YouTube's freelance work, it would turn YouTubers essentially into employees of YouTube, or at least it could if it was interpreted in such a broad manner. I don't know if it will, and this bill I don't imagine is going to go well, because I don't even think that California senators will end up voting for it, considering that their constituents just barely rejected this law. So I don't see this bill going anywhere particularly, but this just kind of shows where Biden's head has been at this entire time. And it really is a huge issue. Moving on, however, to another story actually with regard to Texas, where the Texas AG is actually getting sued by Twitter. Now, this was spurred on by an investigation that the AG is doing into Twitter's ban of Trump, essentially asking themselves if there was any collusion that was going on with regard to them and Facebook or something like that, essentially looking into any potential antitrust or whatever you could potentially do in terms of litigation against Twitter. And Twitter has been making the argument throughout this that they have First Amendment rights, and that this particular investigation is violating said First Amendment right. Now, this has a huge amount of issues, especially coming from Twitter. First of all, we're going to talk about how this conflicts with the law. For instance, Section 230. They have a free speech right, just like a phone company has a free speech right. In this instance, Twitter has a tentative possible right to ban anyone it wants. This is unclear in the law through Section 230. It's one of the problems with the law is that it is unclear. There is a catch-all provision in Section 230, but how far that catch-all provision is necessarily intended to go is unclear, and it has been made exquisitely obvious that justices like Justice Clarence Thomas want to have that revised or reinterpreted, and believe that the courts were doing it way too broadly. Not only that, but they also have problems with previous court law, because there was court law back a few years ago, I think it was in 2017 or 2018 when this has happened, where Trump famously was sued by people he blocked for blocking them, saying it was a violation of their First Amendment rights to not have access to Trump's Twitter. Now, this becomes a bit of a problem for Twitter right now because, well, they didn't really have a First Amendment right to ban Trump's Twitter account. Because at that point, for those of you who may forget, he was still president. Meaning they were actually banning what the court had already decided was a public platform protected by free speech, protected by the First Amendment explicitly, and put under the same regulations the government is actually put under with regard to who and who can't ban for speech, which is to say it can't ban pretty much anyone. That's what Twitter is trying to argue at this point. But of course, this isn't the only issue with it. It's not just law that Twitter was afoul over, but it's also morality. Because in the spirit of free speech, they're arguing for in this case, they have violated it itself. Because what they are arguing at this point is they are arguing they have a free speech right to censor. And from a law perspective, that may be the case depending on the context. In terms of an actual free speech spirit, in the spirit of free speech, it violates it outright. If you are banning people for political speech or the like, and not something that's, say, objectively objectionable, like porn or something like that, what ends up happening is you're running afoul of the spirit of free speech. Because the point of free speech is so that people can present ideas that are sometimes uncomfortable to other people. That's the point. And so Twitter arguing that, oh no, we are not running afoul of free speech. Actually, you're running afoul of free speech by questioning our censorship. It is utterly ridiculous. And I hope that this suit doesn't work. I mean, it's never a sure thing, as the court is kind of a crapshoot at this point. But I hope it doesn't. And I really do hope that the AG's investigation continues and is able to actually bring about some litigation with regard to Twitter, because it's getting ridiculous. It really, really is. And it's not going to be solved on a federal level. People have this idea in their head that the federal government would just work if we get in the right people, or if we get in a president, or anything like that. That's not true. It really isn't. Because the federal government follows the line of the local and state governments. The truth is in this country that even throughout all of the federal overreach, even throughout all of the centralization of power that has happened over the last century, even through all of that, power still flows up in America. Power still flows from the local government to the state government to the federal government. That still is how it works, and the federal government is always following whatever the local governments are doing. And so if you aren't paying attention to your local government, if you aren't trying to change this stuff on a local level, which is why I say that the Florida stuff is such a good first step, because it really shows that the states, the localities, are starting to move in the direction of not being in favor of tax censorship. And once you get to the point where that is not just Florida, but many states across the union, it becomes a much better sell in the federal government, because it becomes much more clear that many of their constituents are explicitly in favor of such, because they voted people in the state and local governments to actually do that. That's the truth there. And you really do need to, figure that out. Moving on, though, to our last story. And this one is with regard to COVID, because an interesting thing has occurred, actually. An interesting update, where a COVID outbreak has actually happened in a place where everyone was vaccinated. And there is some context surrounding this, which makes it sound a little bit less bad than it seemingly is. Because what has happened is, though it has broken out in this nursing home, which sounds really bad, honestly, what has ended up happening is that the outbreak is not as bad as anyone expected it to be. And the reason is because the vaccine, at least it's clear at this point, the vaccine does not necessarily keep you from getting it. All right, and that's kind of a flaw of the vaccine. The vaccine should work. It shouldn't be flawed in this way. And anyone who claims that, oh no, that's just how it's supposed to work, it's not flawed at all, are selling you crazy pills. This is a clearly flawed vaccine. But what it has done is it has lessened the severity of the disease, which is very good. But this incident makes clear, at least to me, is it makes clear exactly what the strategy should be for who should be getting the vaccine in the first place, which is exactly what all of the reasonable people have been claiming this entire way through, which is the old people should get it, and the young people should get it on a case-by-case basis if they're really fat or something. Which Yeah, seems reasonable, especially after this, because, well, you can still get it, but it's going to have a lessened effect, and because it's going to be a lessened effect, it's not going to spread as much, because guess what? Respiratory diseases spread through symptoms, which is, by the way, why asymptomatic spread is such a ridiculous concept for a respiratory disease, because, all right, I'm going to put you through a crash course a bit on respiratory diseases and respiratory viruses. Respiratory viruses spread, and they multiply by destroying certain cells in your throat and throughout your respiratory tract. It's a bit of a oversimplification, but it will do for now. So just make it clear, they're destroying cells in your esophagus and your respiratory system, and they're doing that, and they're multiplying through that, all right? And through doing that, they are also causing symptoms, which then expel the disease outside of your mouth, through a cough or the like, or a sneeze or something like that. And when that happens, the disease is then able to spread to other people, all right? Clear, basic understanding of virus biology. That is how respiratory diseases work, and COVID is no different. Now, here is why asymptomatic spread is not a logical explanation for anything. Here's why. The act of the virus multiplying, and thus having the amount of virus needed to actually spread to another person, and the act of creating symptoms is the same, which means that if the virus is not causing enough of those reactions in your throat, if it isn't destroying enough, cells, if it isn't doing enough to reproduce itself to create symptoms, then it isn't doing enough to spread to anyone else, or at least it's not doing anywhere near enough to spread at least effectively. So, from that, you can then assume that asymptomatic spread is either so meaningless as to not really be worthwhile as a statistic to look at, or it just doesn't exist at all. That is the truth. That is the truth. That is something that has been known for, I think, centuries at this point. It's been known for as long as we've understood how viruses work, period. Yet, people try to make you believe that science simply flipped on its head in the last year. Same thing happened with masks, by the way, and did you see how that turned out in the video 2 days ago? My Monday video? And man, it really went well. Oh, it did exactly what I said it would, because I understand how basic science has worked for the past 100 years. I understand that there's no pro-mask studies for the past 100 years, since 1919, since the last time this scam was pushed on us, and it actually worked. In Spanish flu, for those who don't know, there was pushes for mask mandates, and it actually happened in particular states, California being one of them. And it didn't work. They found out it didn't work, and then they didn't do it because masks didn't work. 100 years later, we do the same thing with no actual studies to actually make it seem logical, other than extremely controlled, non-representative lab studies and models, otherwise known as fake studies. That was it. Same goes with asymptomatic spread. Asymptomatic spread, I don't even think that was pushed in 1919. I don't even think that was pushed in 1918 with the Spanish flu. That's such a new concept that it's just unknown. But it has no data to actually help itself other than the fake data created by models, and that's how that has worked. It really, really sucks. This scientific thing that has happened, or I guess political thing you might more accurately call it. This politicization of much of science, it really sucks. It really, really does, because I have to talk out against a whole lot of people who are really credentialed, and I have to be really precise in what I say most of the time. It's just, it's not really fun, but hey, it's always really satisfying when it comes out that I'm right, so that's great. And I'm going to leave it off there. Wherever you guys are, though, do subscribe. If you like the content, you like the video, subscribe. And if you're on YouTube, look down below. There are lots of very pretty links down there that bring you to sites that are not trash. So go and look there, because there are many, many good ones, all right? So that's a good thing. Also, I like to post my thoughts, mostly on Minds, though I do sometimes, occasionally, post on other places as well. And those are also good places to see where I put out links. And that is all. I'm Kel Kidman. This has been Breaking on the Daily. and I'm out.